Well, let's try that again, shall we? An hour and a half late, almost. Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good whatever time of night or day it happens to be, wherever you happen to be. Welcome to Republic News. I'm your hostess, Liviana. This is my post-Saint show, episode 3. The episode title is The Doughnut. You can see the donut in the on-screen image to my left. So, I'm not exactly sure what happened, but I'm not pleased. So I'm starting a little late, obviously. No one is watching. I'm not surprised. Probably a little late for most people. But at any rate, I'm here. I'm going to do the show because the show must go on, as they say. So, without further ado, let me leap into it, and hopefully things will work out this time. Now, as usual, on my Friday night shows, I go over recent news and give some commentary. So, the first article that has come across my desk for this evening's show, for tonight's show, I guess now. It's certainly not evening anymore. It's morning. And I'm going to still say this is 1-4 instead of 1-5, because it's still 1-4 on the West Coast anyway, and I guess in the mountain zone, which is, so half the country roughly, half the continental U.S., that is. Yeah, excuse me. So the first article that comes across my desk for this week is, and like I said earlier, for those who might have caught any part of it, I don't really have these in any semblance of order, so I will just be going through them in the order they came to my attention. The first article comes from GQ, which is Gentleman's Quarterly. It is called No Democrat Deserves a Free Pass Just Because They're Not Trump. This article was published, it says 6 days ago, so whatever date that was. And it says, as much as you may not want it to happen, the 2020 primaries have begun. The field of contenders for the Democrats right now is both completely theoretical and ridiculously crowded. Essentially, any Democrat whose name has come up in the last 2 years is possibly in the mix, and that includes both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. But pundits are more interested in a new showdown in the primaries, the alleged war between Bernie Sanders and Beto O'Rourke. First of all, it's important to get the actual backstory out of the way. There is no evidence that Sanders is directing or supporting, tacitly or otherwise, a shadow war against the Beto O'Rourke presidential run. That whole idea started because of a tweet from the director of the biggest liberal think tank in the country, the Center for American Progress, which has a spotty track record of actually supporting progressive goals or candidates. When journalist David Sirota shared O'Rourke's record of accepting oil and gas donations, CAP director and Hillary crusader Neera Tanden took it to 11, calling on Bernie Sanders to repudiate such, quote, attacks, end quote, by his, quote, supporters, end quote. And it shows a tweet from Neera Tanden. I saw this, and it was cringeworthy. She followed up by saying, quote, I have no candidate in 2020. We can't destroy whoever the nominee is, end quote. This is extremely backwards framing, but it's not uncommon. Democrats are all on the same team, the argument goes, and shouldn't they close ranks to defeat Donald Trump? but it's akin to saying that no one is allowed to critique any Democrat ever in case they may eventually run for president. It's based on a flawed argument about Trump's victory that Sanders insufficiently backed Hillary Clinton after the primaries, despite a bigger portion of his supporters voting for her than hers did for Barack Obama in 2008. It also ignores the fact that the Republican Party is very ideologically fractured, keeps lurching further from the center, and went through a vicious primary in 2016 only to emerge with total control of the federal government. On one level, the need to whip up support seems to make sense, if for no other reason than the Democrats don't have nearly as deep a bench as the Republicans of prominent party line-towing suits, ready to swap in whenever an old one falls. But it's also important to keep in mind that if there's anything we should be able to judge politicians on, it's their policy and their beliefs. Is it an attack on Joe Biden, for example, to bring up his history of working against school integration, or that time that he said he has, quote, no empathy, end quote, for young people struggling to get by because his generation, quote, decided that we were going to change the world and we did, end quote? Defeating Donald Trump in 2020 can't be the ultimate goal of the party because Trump isn't going to just go away. Even if he does lose, there's almost no chance he'll give up Twitter or the campaign rallies, even with no campaign to run. And even if he decides to never run for office again, his influence and all the factors that put him in the White House in the first place aren't going to go away after just one election. Democrats need to do more to justify their leadership than just putting up candidates whose top qualities are charm and not being Ted Cruz, or they risk letting Trump or someone even worse eventually step into the vacuum that they leave open. Even when the pragmatic centrist choice defeats the hardline right-winger, that's not necessarily a long-term win. Look at Emmanuel Macron in France. His victory over the racist Marine Le Pen of the borderline fascist Front National Party was seen as a huge stumble for a string of far-right victories in Europe, but Macron's policies have only exacerbated deep problems in France, and national protests have rocked the country since his administration decided, among other things, to cut taxes on the wealthy and raise them for everyone else by implementing a new gas tax. Macron is now so unpopular that many in France are calling for him to resign instead of finish his term. We'll pause in the reading of this at this point to point out that this business about being pragmatic and centrist, man, I have gone over this and over this and over this. I've talked to my own people on Twitter. I mean, fellow so-called progressives, fellow so-called leftists, and tried to get across the point that we should stop calling the neoliberals in the Democratic Party centrists. They love to call themselves that. They've tried to portray themselves as centrist ever since they seized control of the party apparatus in roughly 1992-93. Now, I'll give you a little bit of history, of course, because I do this. The Republicans won pretty solidly throughout the 1980s. And that started with Reagan in the 1980 election and continued with Reagan again in the 1984 election, and then George Bush the Elder in the 1988 election. So they pretty well locked down the 80s. From 81 until 93, the Republicans were dominant. They certainly won the White House in all three of those elections, and were pretty dominant in the two chambers of Congress as well. Now, they weren't entirely in control of Congress. I do remember Tip O'Neill, Democrat, being Speaker of the House for a while. But yeah, the message which the Republicans used to get themselves elected, and they used actually quite a few different messages, but the one which seemed to impress the Democrats so mightily was what the Republicans were calling fiscal conservatism. So the Democrats got it in their heads. Now some of them, Tony Coelho and Bill Clinton, the new Democrat or the Democratic Leadership Council, Third Way, these different think tanks. They got it in their heads, and there was a group where I think the Democratic Leadership Council was actually started in the mid-'70s, but they didn't have a lot of success selling their crap at the time. So what was their crap? Their crap was neoliberalism. Now, I've talked about neoliberalism many times. Neoliberalism is a type of corporatism. Corporatism is an extreme right-wing economic perspective. And it has a few different types. The two most well-known are fascism and neoliberalism. Fascism is, let me just say, any type of corporatism involves either union of or collusion between state and corporate power. I've pointed out before there are some superficial differences between neoliberalism and fascism, mostly rhetorical. I mean, the fascists talk about nationalism. That's a rhetorical appeal. They make a lot of rhetorical appeals. You can see rhetorical appeals quite frequently in American politics. For example, with all of the so-called guardians of decency who proclaim themselves moral, and they're going to come down on prostitution or pornography or homosexuality or whatever they think is morally disgusting. And mind you, I said whatever they think is morally disgusting. I have no problem with any of those things. We've seen this again and again and again. Jim Baker having an affair with the church secretary. Jimmy Swaggart getting caught with a prostitute. I can't even remember all the names of the politicians because they have been many who have proclaimed themselves to be anti-gay and got caught doing gay things, basically. There's nothing wrong with doing gay things, you know it, but if you're going to claim not to support gay rights and same-sex marriage and so forth, it's probably a good idea not to get yourself caught trying to solicit gay sex with another man in the bathroom, in a public bathroom. And, these things have happened. We could look at the Nazis, for example, in the Weimar Republic. In the 30s, after they had taken power. Look at the cabaret scene in Berlin and see it was by their standards they would have called it degenerate. There was quite a lot of interesting activities going on. But anyway, they made rhetorical appeals to patriotism. They made rhetorical appeals to the middle class. They made rhetorical appeals to traditional values. They made rhetorical appeals to, even to nationalism. And they do put on a very good show of nationalism, but when the chips fall, they're out, sending Stukas and tanks into Poland to conquer their neighbors. Now, I'm not going to say that the Polish corridor was a good idea, splitting Germany in half like that, and making Danzig a free city, and those were territories that had been German since well, since at least 1871, when the German Empire was united from among the various German states, kingdoms, and duchies, and so forth, which had existed prior to that. But certainly East Prussia and all of that area there from Brandenburg all the way over to Memel had been in Prussian hands, and I said Prussian hands for quite a while. Going back to the Teutonic Knights in the Middle Ages. And, I'm not going to say that was, entirely ethically justified, that they had a right to it or anything of the sort. That was a lot of, let's go convert the Balts to Christianity by means of the sword, and while we're at it, let's take over their lands and shit too and turn them into serfs. Yeah, not a good thing. But as far as the Poles having any ancestral territorial right to that land that formed the Polish corridor, yeah, I don't think so. I mean, those were the old Prussians that were there in that territory, not the Poles. So, and the old Prussians were not Germanic. So, I mean, there are a lot of people who don't understand what Prussian and Old Prussian refer to. They're two different ethnic groups, two different linguistic groups. The Prussians that we think of today wearing their Pickelhauben and so forth, the spiked helmets and all of that, with the white and black flag and the German eagle, the Prussian eagle. Those people were Germanic. And I mean, there was certainly a large portion of the population who were descended, at least, from the Old Prussians. But the Old Prussians were Balts. They were Baltic peoples. They spoke a Baltic language. If you're interested in that, William R. Schmalstig from Pennsylvania State University did at least a couple of books on Old Prussian grammar, and I forget what the other one was called, Studies in Old Prussian, that was it, yes. And there was a smaller book that he had. I'm not really sure what that one was now. And he may have done other things after those. Those were the ones that I got copies of in the 1980s. So, I mean, I talked with someone who was at Penn State back in the, well, it's been over a decade ago now. So, I mean, but it was in this century. And they said William R. Schmalstig was still there at Penn State and still doing his Old Prussian studies and so forth. So it's entirely possible that he has published additional material on Old Prussian since then. At any rate, the Baltic peoples are the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and the Old Prussians. And they speak Baltic languages. Old Prussian is now a dead language. There are some people who are trying to revive it or reconstruct it or whatever. And Lithuanian is a Baltic language, and Latvian is a Baltic language. So, I mean, they're not Germanic, they're not Slavic. Poles are Slavic, and their language is Slavic. Anyway, how did I get off on this? Goodness, I've managed to chase another rabbit, and my boyfriend is going to say, look, see what happens when you chase rabbits? Anyway, yeah. Oh, yes. The Nazis were not content, of course, with just taking the Polish corridor or the Sudetenland in the Czechoslovakia, or, they weren't content with taking back a territory which had previously been held by the German Empire, is my point. They had delusions of grandeur that they were going to conquer the world. The Italian fascists likewise started invading other countries, Libya, Egypt, Ethiopia. They were going to reform the Roman Empire, so they thought, well, I mean, you can call yourself nationalist all you want, but if you're engaging in imperialism, dude, you're an imperialist. You're not a nationalist. So once again, rhetoric. And I quote very often a passage from Machiavelli about appearance versus reality, and how often people are moved by things which seem to be rather than by things which are. So when you get into these rhetorical, superficial differences, don't pay them a lot of heed. Now, the neoliberals are blatantly and openly globalist. They admit this. They advocate for global corporatism, or corporate globalism, or whatever you want to call it. And no, when I say globalism, I'm not talking about international Jewry or any other fucking nonsensical fascist conspiracy theories like that. This has nothing to do with Jews or anything of the sort. It's not a racist thing. It's a capitalist thing. It's capitalism on steroids and mutated into some monstrosity. And I mean, I'm not real fond of capitalism even when it hasn't mutated, but nevertheless, corporatism, the difference between the only substantial difference between fascism and neoliberalism types of corporatism is not whether they're nationalist or globalist or globalization, whatever. People are trying to say that globalism now is a racist thing, and no, it's not. I mean, we were talking about globalism back in 2003, and we were talking about neoliberalism. We were talking about global corporatism and corporate globalism. The terms were interchangeable, and what we meant when we were talking about that was neoliberalism. So forget about that bullshit about nationalism versus globalism, because that's not what the real difference is. The real difference is quite simple. Like I said, corporatism involves either a union between, or a union of, or a collusion between state and corporate power. In the case of fascism, the state retains the upper hand. Corporate power is made to serve the interests of the state, and the state will help, prop up industries and corporations so long as they serve the interests of the state. But they will certainly prop them up. They are fiercely pro-capitalist and intensely anti-communist. So for all of you people who want to say, but their name was National Socialist, blah, 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 blah. Yes, I am very well aware of that. You know what else? The Democratic Party calls itself democratic too, doesn't it? The Democratic People's Republic of North Korea calls itself democratic, doesn't it? Do you know that the Democratic Party in 1973 revised their charter and bylaws to prevent any kind of grassroots reform or takeover of the party, and to cement in positions of power those who already held power in the Democratic Party? That doesn't sound very democratic to me, does it to you? How about 1982 when they voted to create the superdelegate system, 1984 when they implemented the superdelegate system. Superdelegates, people who have a bigger voice than the voters. Yeah, that doesn't sound very democratic to me either. So, I mean, you can call yourself Jack Sparrow, but it doesn't make you Jack Sparrow. I mean, like I've said many times before, if I start calling myself Mary Queen of Scots, are you guys going to start referring to me as Your Royal Majesty? Just because I said I'm Mary Queen of Scots, you're going to call me Mary? It doesn't mean that I'm Mary Queen of Scots just because I say I am. Jesus Christ, come on. I mean, anyway. The Nazis rounded up leftists, socialists, communists, even labor union members and social democrats, and sent them to prison camps as part of the Nacht und Nebel program that was for political prisoners. They did this to Roman Catholics who were protesting the war. They did it to Freemasons because Freemasons oppose all forms of tyranny, whether civil or religious. They did it to anybody who seemed to them to be a political dissident. But especially they did it to communists and socialists of all types, and labor union members and social democrats. So don't give me this shit that the Nazis were socialists. They weren't. Well, they were national socialists, whereas the Marxists are international socialists. No, and absolutely not again. No, you're wrong. Go read some fucking history, and I don't mean some shit that Stefan Molyneux or one of those idiots came up with. I mean actual history. Anyway, so the only substantial difference between neoliberalism and fascism in its various forms, including Nazism, is who's in control, who has the upper hand in this partnership or collusion or union between state and corporate power. And in fascism, it's the state. In neoliberalism, the state becomes the servant of corporate power. So you have all these subsidies to industries, you have bailouts to the, the capitalists who screw up, and no punishment for them for screwing up. You've got tax cuts and tax incentives for corporations and the wealthy, who are usually involved in some kind of corporate shenanigans. You have deregulation, you have anti-labor policies, blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, quite a lot of similarity, a lot of similar policies and laws in both fascism and neoliberalism, which is why a lot of people can't tell the difference between them. But the answer is always, which of the two has the upper hand? If it be the state, then you're looking at fascism. If it be the corporations, then you're looking at neoliberalism. When you have multinational corporations who are doing whatever the hell they want, and they've got this revolving door with the, with state, in that, you've got people who work in executive positions or as lobbyists for this or that huge corporation, coming into cabinet positions and being appointed to things like Secretary of the Treasury or Secretary of the Interior or head of the EPA, or, you nominate a petroleum industry exec to come in and be the head of the EPA. Yeah, that's not a conflict of interest at all, is it? And, so quite a lot of people, when they leave government positions, go into working as lobbyists and so forth. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make here is that neoliberalism is extreme right-wing economics. It's not centrist. So the Democrats in the late 80s, after having been thoroughly trounced several times by the Republicans, decided that what they needed to do was appeal to the fiscal conservatives who were constantly putting the Republicans in power, because otherwise the Democrats didn't think they were ever going to get in power again. So what did they do? Well, they ran a young, somewhat attractive, kind of popular looking, the guy got on Arsenio Hall and played the saxophone. He was on MTV. He was a young, hip, with it, kind of new blood, and he was a new Democrat, and that's what they started calling themselves eventually, was the New Democrats, just like Tony Blair started calling his group New Labor. And they did the exact same thing. They mixed what they called fiscal conservatism, which is a bullshit term. It's not fiscal conservatism, it's right-wing economics. Conservatism is a term that applies to attitudes toward change in society and or culture. Right-wing is a term that applies to economics. Now, in the 1980s, the two terms became conflated, and even Barry Goldwater, who in the 1960s and 50s was known as Mr. Conservative, complained about how the Republican Party had changed, that the people that were calling themselves conservatives weren't conservatives, they were right-wing extremists. And this coming from Barry Goldwater, so if you want to understand what conservatism actually is, you can go and look at Dwight David Ike Eisenhower, for example. But if you don't want to know what conservatism is, you can go and look at Ronald Reagan. take this so-called fiscal conservatism and mix it with social liberalism, and that makes you a centrist? No, it makes you a far-right, it makes you an extreme right-wing economics dude who gives lip service, at least, to socially liberal ideas. There's nothing centrist about that. You're right-wing. Own it. Anyway, so this is something I love to rant about because people love to, you know, kind of reduce everything to this one-dimensional single line continuum, which is limited and limiting, and it's very unimaginative. And I mean, I have a series of articles I have written and am writing a third article 4 at the moment about dimensions of perspective, and this is, I mean, it's an analogy to talk about these things as dimensions because it doesn't quite work, but you know, it is an analogy. It's not meant to be taken literally. There's not like 300,000 different dimensions of, you know, width and depth and height and time and rotation and whatever else that go into making up a given person's perspective or worldview or whatever you want to call it. But certainly there are more than just politics, and that includes economics and everything else. No. We're talking about social attitudes, we're talking about cultural attitudes, we're talking about economic perspectives, we're talking about attitudes towards order versus chaos. We're talking about attitudes towards liberty versus authoritarianism. We're talking about attitudes about centralization versus decentralization. We're talking about attitudes regarding imperialism on one end and isolationism on the other end. You know, there are all kinds of different things that go together to make up a given person's perspective that usually just gets lumped together into what is called politics. And part of the reason for this is because there were not always clear distinctions made in the past between these things, and in some cases they were intentionally blurred. But anyway, let me get back to the article here. Yeah, so I mean, Macron is not a centrist either. Marine Le Pen is maybe a borderline fascist Front National. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with her views to say, but certainly she was characterized as such. But Macron is himself an extreme right-winger. He just happens to be a neoliberal and not a fascist. And I know he wants to portray himself as a centrist and blah, 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 just like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, but there's nothing centrist about them. So, the article then concludes, if the Democratic establishment insists on trying to crown another favorite candidate, like it did Clinton in 2016, then no one should be surprised if we see a repeat of 2016 on Election Day. And as embarrassing as that will be for the party, it'll be much worse for the rest of us. So, I mean, this is something I've been saying for quite a while now. If the Democrats try to nominate another neoliberal corporatist, like Hillary Clinton or, you know, Beto O'Rourke. I mean, the guy is a member of the New Democrat Coalition, and that is a neoliberal organization. It's one of these so-called third way groups. It's very interesting that they should call themselves third way too. I mean, there is a think tank or something called Third Way now, which is the successor of the Democratic Leadership Council. But the term third way was in use for quite a while to refer to this new Democrat perspective that was started with Tony Coelho and Bill Clinton, and also has been used to refer to the New Labour of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in the UK. Third way. And I say it's very interesting because the fascists and the Nazis, who are a type of fascist, have referred to their own view as third position. So that's quite interesting, and it's really annoying too, because by trying to cast themselves in such a way and actually still being part of the bifurcation fallacy, they discourage people from coming out of the bifurcation fallacy. There is a third path. There actually is a third path, and I'm not talking about third parties, although that's a part of it. There's an old poem from Scotland, Ballad of True Thomas, or the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer. And in this, it talks about Thomas of Ercildoune, having met the Queen of Elfheim, or the home of the elves, and she takes him out, and as they're traveling through this kind of surrealistic landscape, she points him to three paths. And there's the narrow path, but it's a straight and narrow path, but it's thick beset with thorns and briars. And she tells him that is the path of righteousness, though after it but few inquires. See ye not yon braid road that winds, this is curving, winding, broad road. That's the road to wickedness. And then she points him to, but see ye not yon bonny road that lies across the lily laven? Oh no, wait, yeah. So, let me see here. See ye not yon bonny road? Anyway, I can't remember it now, strangely enough, but there is a third path, the bonny road, and she says that is the path to fair Elfland, where you and I this night maun gie, where you and I this night must go. So there was a rejection of the Jesus versus Satan kind of false dilemma there that demonstrated that the heathen tradition was still alive, very much alive in the time of Thomas. And Thomas was an actual historical personage. He was credited as being a kind of soothsayer, truth speaker, a person who could give prophecies about the future. So anyway, and he did go to Elfheim, according to the legends. He went to into the Shia, the mounds, and came back out, and was gifted with this kind of what is called in Gaelic Doughnut, the double vision, or the two seeing, the two sights. Some people call it second sight, but literally it means double viewing. Anyway, so I mean, there is that third path, and it's not Nazism or fascism or neoliberalism. It's not taking a little bit of one and a little bit of the other and mixing them together and calling it whatever. No, it's something completely different. It's a rejection of the false dilemma. It's a rejection of the bifurcation fallacy. Anyway, so I do have a few other articles here, and I've spent over half an hour talking about this one, as is my usual custom, right? So let's see what's going on here. The next article I have, yeah. This is related, so I mean, I probably don't need to rant about all the things that I'm ranting about, because a lot of these articles are going to be talking about some of the same things. This one comes from, goodness gracious, I'm not really sure where this comes from. It comes from Truthdig, expert reporting, current news, provocative columnists, by Norman Solomon, and it is, let's see, I'm not sure when this was published. I don't see a date on it. I see when I printed it, which was the 3rd, but that doesn't mean that's when it came out. Anyway, the article is called "Corporate Democrats Are Already Punching Left Ahead of 2020. Now, The author, the columnist who wrote this, Norman Solomon, is coordinator of the online activist group rootsaction.org. Now, when we talk about punching left, when we say the Democrats punch left and move right, what we're talking about is they attack the left and then move themselves further to the right. And this has been their standard operating procedure since the late 80s or early 90s. So, anyway, the article says, well-informed public discussion is a major hazard for Democratic Party elites now eager to prevent Bernie Sanders from winning the 2020 presidential nomination. A clear focus on key issues can bring to light the big political differences between Sanders and the party's corporate-friendly candidates. One way to muddy the waters is to condemn people for pointing out facts that make those candidates look bad. And this is referring to the same kind of thing that the GQ article I just read was talking about. National polling shows that the U.S. public strongly favors bold policy proposals that Sanders has been championing for a long time on issues ranging from climate change to Medicare for all to tuition-free public college to Wall Street power. The party's base has been moving leftward, largely propelled by an upsurge of engagement from progressive young people. This momentum is a threat to the forces accustomed to dominating the Democratic Party. In recent weeks, Texas Representative Beto O'Rourke has become a lightning rod in a gathering political storm, largely because of the vast hype about him from mass media and Democratic power brokers. At such times, when spin goes into overdrive, we need incisive factual information. Investigative journalist David Sirota provided it in a deeply researched 20th of December article which The Guardian published under the headline, Beto O'Rourke frequently voted for Republican legislation, analysis reveals. Originating from the nonprofit Capital and Maine news organization, the piece reported that, quote, even as O'Rourke represented one of the most solidly Democratic congressional districts in the United States, he has frequently voted against the majority of House Democrats in support of Republican bills and Trump administration priorities, end quote. Progressives have good reasons to like some of O'Rourke's positions, but Sirota's reporting drilled down into his voting record, reviewing the 167 votes O'Rourke has cast in the House in opposition to the majority of his own party during his 6-year tenure in Congress. Many of those votes were not progressive dissents alongside other left-leaning lawmakers, but instead votes to help pass Republican-sponsored legislation, end quote. So, let's see. I'm going to skip down a little bit here. Well, no, I'm not. The meticulous and in-depth reporting by Sirota was a public service, but some angry reactions were classic instances of blaming the messenger for the unfavorable news. And I mean, it's not like progressives didn't already know Beto's record. So, I mean, some of us certainly were familiar with Beto. I had said myself that I was not pleased with his record on most things, that he did have some positions that and some of his record was impressive, but he wasn't really a progressive. But I said that if I were still in Texas, I would probably vote for him because, I mean, a syphilitic monkey would be a better senator than Ted Cruz. You know, so I mean, it's not a very high bar that you have to set there in order to get over it. Yeah, Ted Cruz is just a really despicable individual, in my opinion. Anyway. Let's see. At times vitriolic, the denunciations of Sirota came from people who apparently would have preferred for O'Rourke's actual voting record to remain shrouded in a hagiographic haze. But it's better to learn revealing political facts sooner rather than later. Thanks to Sirota's coverage, for instance, we now know, quote, O'Rourke has voted for GOP bills that his fellow Democratic lawmakers said reinforced Republicans' anti-tax ideology, chipped away at the Affordable Care Act, Act, or ACA, weakened Wall Street regulations, boosted the fossil fuel industry, and bolstered Donald Trump's immigration policy, end quote. The backlash to Sirota's news article was in keeping with a tweet 2 weeks earlier from Neera Tanden, the president of the influential and lavishly funded Center for American Progress, who has long been a major ally of Bill and Hillary Clinton. On the 6th of December, Tanden went over the top in response to a tweet from Sirota, simply mentioning the fact that O'Rourke, quote, is the #2 recipient of oil/gas industry campaign cash in the entire Congress, end quote. I mean, it's a fact. But Tanden lashed out via Twitter, writing, quote, "Oh, look, a supporter of Bernie Sanders attacking a Democrat. This is seriously dangerous. We know Trump is in the White House, and attacking Dems is doing Trump's bidding. I hope Senator Sanders repudiates these attacks in 2019, end quote. Now, the article continues, such calculated nonsense indicates just how panicky some powerful corporate Democrats are about Sanders' likely presidential campaign, and just how anxious they are to protect corporate-oriented candidates from public scrutiny. The quest is to smother meaningful discussions of vital issues that should be center stage during the presidential campaign. Corporate Democrats are gearing up to equate principled, fact-based critiques of their favored candidates with, in Tanden's words, quote, seriously dangerous, end quote, attacks that are, quote, doing Trump's bidding, end quote. I mean, I think they should have put attacks in quotes too, because since when did reporting someone's actual record, speaking the truth, giving the facts about someone's record, when did that become a personal attack? Because she did actually, in another tweet, she referred to it as a personal attack. You know, I'm not really sure when discussing someone's actual activities became a personal attack. I mean, a personal attack is an argumentum ad hominem. Abusive ad hominem is an attempt to change the subject from the matter being discussed, which would be policies and, you know, doing something theoretically better, to a personal attack upon that person's character or their appearance, or, you know, something like that. I mean, so, and I mentioned earlier that when the Democrats found Bill Clinton and got him to run for president in '92, they found a relatively young, somewhat attractive, kind of Southern guy who might have some populist appeal. Went on, you know, Arsenio and played the saxophone, went on MTV. This was back in the days when MTV still had music on. I mean, they do in the middle of the night now, I guess, but back then it was almost all music videos almost all the time. I mean, they did have things like Club MTV, and that was a dance show, and they did have, I guess, toward the end of the 80s, they started doing that Liquid TV, where they were showing a lot of anime and kind of cutting-edge animation. Some stuff that was a little kind of, sometimes a little edgy, you know, and they did have a few other things on, but the vast majority of their programming was music videos. And that was the hip thing. All the kids loved it. All the college kids loved it. I was in college. I loved it. I watched MTV quite a lot. You know, it wasn't 24/7 or anything like that, but I certainly did watch music videos. Anyway, I'm thinking that what they're trying to do with Beto O'Rourke is find another relatively young, somewhat attractive guy from the South who might have some populist appeal. They want to repeat Bill Clinton because they don't have any other formula. They don't have a winning agenda. They don't have anything. They don't have policies. The only thing that they have is, we're not Trump. And, I mean, they had this one, that was going to be their slogan, I guess, last year. That was, I mean, comma, have you seen the other guys? Question mark. What? We're not them. That was it. That was their message. We're not the Republicans. So fucking what? You're just like the fucking Republicans. Every goddamn policy, everything substantial, you do exactly the same as them. It's just minor variations on those policies, and that's it. You're giving us the same neoliberal corporatism as economic policy. You're giving us the same neoconservative imperialism as foreign policy. You're giving us the same authoritarianism as domestic policy, and the only difference there is that there are certain different aspects of our private lives that you want to dictate to us than the ones that the Republicans want to dictate to us. Well, screw you both. I don't want either one of you fucks telling me what to do. You know, you don't get to make my personal decisions for me. That's my choice. That's my freedom. I make my personal decisions for myself. Thanks, but the fuck out, you self-righteous busybodies. And that's true of both of them, Democrat or Republican. It's just they come at it from a slightly different angle. But as far as foreign policy, yes, let's have more wars for profit, because we've got to have those in order to avert the coming Great Depression we're going to have because of the neoliberal corporatism they're pushing as economic policy. That was part of what led to the Great Depression in the first place. Go back to the 1920s and look at what they were doing. I mean, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. What were their policies? Anti-labor, rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, trickle-down economics, anti-regulation, deregulation, pro-monopolism. Let's see, what else did they have? Oh, let's promote bubble economies. I mean, all this shit that we've had for the past 40 years, ever since Reagan got in office, whether the party in power had an R or a D on its jersey. It's the same shit. Now, they think that World War II is what got us out of the Great Depression, and it was certainly a contributing factor, but it was more about putting people back to work in the factories during the war, shipping a bunch of people overseas to die so they weren't here to be, you know, part of the unemployed. And then after the war, rebuilding London and Dusseldorf and all the other places that got bombed into dust, okay? All of that is what got us out of the Great Depression. It was putting people back to work. You're not going to put people back to work with a hard money situation. You're not going to put people back to work with austerity measures. The Federal Reserve Chairman Rummel in the 1940s got the message right back then. You don't need to tax or borrow in order to fund spending with a fiat currency, which Roosevelt had instituted temporarily in 1933 when he took us off the gold standard temporarily. And he followed the example of the United Kingdom in that. They had removed themselves from the gold standard shortly before that. It was working out great for them, so Roosevelt thought, hey, let's do that here too. And, you know, you have basically liberated your currency from the chain of the gold standard. Now let me explain to you what I mean by this. Let's say we have $1,000 in circulation and 1,000 bars of gold in Fort Knox, backing up those dollars. Okay? Now, if you want to increase the money in circulation, and you have to do this if you want to put more people to work, because if you've only got 1,000 $1 bills floating around, you can only employ 1,000 people for $1 a day or whatever, and money keeps moving around, and yeah, all kinds of weird shit goes on. But basically, you can't employ a lot of people, and so you wind up with very high unemployment. So let's increase the amount of currency in circulation. How do we do that? Well, let's print and mint some more currency. So let's double the amount of currency that we have in circulation from $1,000 to $2,000. Now, before we did that, $1 was worth an entire gold bar. Now that we've done that, and now we've got twice as many dollars in circulation, $1 is worth half of a gold bar. You have inherently and necessarily devalued the currency. It's worth less. Therefore, it buys less. So inflation occurs. Prices go up. That happens naturally. It's inherent whenever you have a physical commodity backing your currency. Unless you go out and dig up some more gold, you know, to back that extra currency you've introduced into circulation, then you have to devalue the currency whenever you increase the amount of circulation. But Roosevelt had taken us off the gold standard, and we were suddenly engaging in deficit spending, and that was amazing. It actually did good things. Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard permanently in 1971, freed us from that chain so that currency doesn't have to be backed by a physical commodity anymore. Almost every modern nation has a free-floating, sovereign, non-convertible fiat currency nowadays, not backed by any physical commodity. You have a few exceptions in the European Union. Why? Because they don't issue their own currency. The European Union issues their currency. The United Kingdom kept their currency, and they are still the issuer of a sovereign, free-floating, non-convertible fiat currency. So they can do just fine without the EU. They are going to have to work out some kind of trade deal with somebody in order to, you know, not sink into oblivion. If this Brexit thing goes ahead. At any rate, the reason Greece is in such economic woe is because they gave up their sovereign currency and they adopted the euro dollar. There are a number of other examples I can give you, but the point is, yeah, you don't want a hard money situation. That was one of the things that contributed to the Great Depression. You don't want anti-labor policies. You don't want trickle-down economics, which is what it was called in the 1920s, and it was called horse and sparrow in the 1890s, and when Reagan came along, they called it supply-side economics. But it's the same shit. And money does not, in fact, trickle down. It trickles up, as Will Rogers pointed out. Give a poor man $1 and the rich man will have it before the day is over, but at least it will have passed through the poor man's hands first. And frankly, you cannot sustain an economy unless the people have the resources to buy things, goods and services. So, I mean, the rich are going to fuck themselves by doing this, and this is what they're promoting. It's the rich who are promoting this crap because they're economically illiterate. They don't understand. But also, because neoliberalism says the surfaces of the world's economy are movable, which in ordinary English for you and me means, yeah, you can move your factory overseas or, you know, to a third world country down in Central America or whatever and turn it into a sweatshop where you don't have to worry about any regulations to protect the environment or minimum wage or, you know, an 8-hour work day or 40-hour work week or, you know, workers' compensation for injuries on the job because you didn't have a safe working environment. You know, all these other things. So you can maximize your profit while paying out very little. Sure, you can go ahead and move your factory to some other country. It's perfectly fine because profit is success and success is life. Except then going to war doesn't put people back to work because the factories aren't here for people to go back to work in anymore, you stupid fucks. See, Democrats and Republicans are fucking retarded. Oh no, I mean, there are a few exceptions, okay? Certainly we will be talking about some of them either tonight or tomorrow, but at any rate, so, I mean, I can go on and read the rest of this, but I think I'll just go ahead and put this article into the video description so you can read it for yourself. Let me see. Did I go ahead and... I think I may have already... No, I didn't. Okay, so... I do have a few more articles. I'm not going to go... I probably won't go more than 2 hours tonight. I think I've probably been going for about an hour now. I'm not entirely sure. I'll look here in just a moment to see. But I have, I think, a total of 18 articles that I had planned to read for this show, and I may not get to all of them, but that's fine if I don't, because I've got tomorrow's show I'll be doing as well, in which I will continue to read the articles that I didn't get to tonight, and I'll probably be a little less annoyed than I am at the moment, having started about an hour late due to computer issues, which didn't, make me any less willing to rant about these things here. So, yeah, and I mean, I'm going to rant because that's what I do. But, I'll tell you something. I don't yell like certain Debbies or Kyles. I don't yell at you watching my streams or my videos. So I hope that's kind of a plus, even if I do rant a bit. And you know that what I'm saying I can back up with facts and citations and so forth. So let's see. The next article I have is, I'm not sure I actually got this one because I kept looking for this. Yeah, I did. Okay. And this was one that I had a lot of trouble getting to open. This was actually published in December. It was from the 10th of December, 2018. It's from In These Times. And the article title is How the Left Can Win in 2020 Primary Centrist Democrats in Blue Districts. That's how the left can win. And the left, mind you, is not the Democratic Party, contrary to partisan rhetoric. There we go again. There's a common theme running through the show tonight. I've talked about rhetoric more than once, and I'll probably talk about it again. But at any rate, let me have, before I dive into this article, I'm going to take a look into the external text chat and see. I thought I saw Kuhn out there, Curated Opinions Kuhn, say something earlier. And it looks like we've still got one person watching, so that may be Kuhn, I'm not sure. But I don't see any comments or questions, so I'm going to dive into this article after all. So, like I said, this is from the 10th of December, 2018. It's from In These Times, and it's by Sean McElwee. It's How the Left Can Win in 2020. Primary centrist Democrats in Blue Districts. Progressive organizations simply don't have enough money, media, or organizers to aggressively contest primaries in both blue and purple districts. The blue wave that wiped out the Republican House majority brought a number of surprises in heavily GOP districts. Kendra Horn now holds a seat in deep red Oklahoma, and Joe Cunningham pulled through in South Carolina. But even as Democrats seemed to win House races everywhere, many candidates upon whom progressive organizations staked big bets came up short. Randy Bryce, Wisconsin, Jess King of Pennsylvania, Liuba Gretchen Shirley of New York, Amar Kambanajar of California, and Leslie Cockburn of Virginia, all contesting red seats and endorsed by insurgent progressive groups, lost. One reason is simple: they were in tougher than average districts, but the other problem is strategic. Backing bomb throwers in purple and red districts is not how to pull the party left. One theory of change guiding some campaigns this cycle has been that an unapologetic left platform could boost turnout and win over working-class voters in Republican areas where Bernie Sanders performed well in the 2016 Democratic primary. The problem, of course, is that Bernie was running in the Democratic primary. His success doesn't tell us what general election voters want in these districts. This is not to say that a Medicare for All candidate cannot win, simply that Democratic primaries offer the best hope to get insurgent candidates in office and pull the party left. To see why, merely count the unabashed progressives who won primary challenges in safe Democratic districts. We're going to talk about some of these unabashed so-called progressives, too, either tonight or tomorrow. then sailed to victory in the general election. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York, Deb Haaland of New Mexico, Chuy Garcia of Illinois, Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, Johanna Hayes of Connecticut, Joe Neguse of Colorado, Neguse, I don't know, Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. Only one retiring Democrat, Representative Colin Hanabusa of Hawaii, was replaced by someone who is likely to be to their right. Meanwhile, no progressive who unseated a Democratic congressional incumbent in the primary went on to lose in the general election. Look also, for instance, at how Ocasio-Cortez has already shifted the conversation around a Green New Deal, which an increasing number of Democrats have now embraced. Run left candidates to seize the safe blue districts, and the mainstream of the party will follow. Yeah, but no. I mean, there's just something that a lot of people don't get, especially a lot of Democrats don't get. And that is the fact that the Democratic Party is not really Democratic Party. It's not a Democratic Party. By that I mean small d Democratic, as in, you know, espousing and elevating the principles of democracy and democratic ideals and so forth. The Democratic Party has an interesting history. It started out as the party of the landed gentry, the agricultural landlords who owned vast swaths of territory, you know, plantations basically, and they were more or less wealthy people. They were sort of akin to the aristocracy of Europe, in that they were landholders, large tracts of land that they held, and they had essentially serfs and slaves. I mean serfs in the sense of indentured servants, and slaves to work those farmlands and ranches for them. Now that's how the Democratic Party started. But it didn't take them very long to embrace the merchant class in the cities, which they did. And for the longest time, the Democratic Party was economically centrist to center-right. And they represented the interests of small business, whereas the Republicans, ever since they got in office in 1861, have represented big business, with the exception of Teddy Roosevelt and Dwight David Eisenhower. So, I mean, you did have a couple of Republicans who bucked the trend, so to speak. But the party as a whole, the Republican Party as a whole, has a long tradition of being very much big business. I don't mean the rank-and-file members of the party, I mean the party establishment. By the same token, the Democratic Party has a very long history of being centrist to center-right, until, we'll get to that. But in 1972, now I can go back to 1916 and talk about Woodrow Wilson stealing Teddy Roosevelt's platform. I can talk about what happened in the 1930s and 40s with the Democratic Party establishment and FDR fighting each other every step of the way. I can talk about how they didn't want him to nominate Henry Wallace as his vice president in 1940 and wanted him to keep the damned Southern conservative Democrat who was his first vice president, who had broken with Roosevelt completely by 1938 and had never supported the New Deal at all. But Henry Wallace, who had been a progressive Republican before that time, became a progressive Democrat in 1936, and he had been supporting FDR's New Deal all along, from the beginning. FDR made him Secretary of Agriculture in 1933 during FDR's first term, right after he was elected. You know, so I mean, I'm not really entirely sure what the Democrats' party establishment big beef was with Wallace at first, but it becomes more apparent as time goes on. So, you know, they didn't want him to be the vice president, but FDR said, look, if you don't let me have the vice president I just won't run for re-election. And they didn't really have any other options, so they relented and said, okay, you can have Wallace as your vice president. In 1944, FDR was a little too weak from illness to fight them again, and they absolutely insisted, no way in hell are you going to have Wallace as your vice president again, so we want Harry Truman. So FDR acquiesced reluctantly to their demands and made Truman his vice president, but to spite them, he named Henry Wallace his Secretary of Commerce. Now, Henry Wallace was a progressive, like FDR, like Teddy Roosevelt before, who was a Republican. Turns out the reason that the Democratic Party establishment didn't want Henry Wallace, there were two reasons, actually. He wanted to advance women's rights, and he was absolutely opposed to racial segregation. Dun dun dun! In the 1940s, after FDR died, Wallace continued in the position of Secretary of Commerce until 1946, when Harry Truman fired him. Wallace then became the editor of the New Republic, a magazine founded in 1913 by the original historical progressives, of which, you know, Henry Wallace was one of the historical progressives. He wasn't one of the people who founded that magazine, but he certainly had that progressive background, the historical progressive background. So from 1946, he began to used the New Republic to attack Truman's policies, particularly the Cold War and the arms buildup and all of that sort of thing. But so there's been quite a lot of history between the Democratic Party establishment and progressives. Now, in 1946 was the dawn of the modern progressivism, which was, I credit Henry Wallace as the father of modern progressivism. In 1968, I mean, I've written about this. You can check out my article at Real Progressives. The article I wrote called The Name Progressive. Its proponents would-be usurpers and wannabe exploiters. And I talk in some detail about what happened in 1968 and 1972. 1972, the progressives actually managed to finally get a progressive nominated for president on the Democratic Party ticket. That was George McGovern. The Democratic Party establishment then went out and started a group called Democrats for Nixon, because they would rather have a Republican than a progressive. And this has been said recently. Over the past couple of years, we've heard this several times. Democrats would rather lose to a Republican than win with a progressive. So in 1973, the Democratic Party establishment, the DNC, they revised their charter and bylaws. They did it in order to prevent any grassroots reform or takeover of the party, which is what had led to McGovern getting the nomination. It was grassroots activism that got McGovern the nomination in 1972. They also did it to make sure that the people who had positions of power in the Democratic Party would be likely to retain their positions of power. And I have gone into some detail pointing out exactly which portions of the Democratic Party charter and bylaws have this kind of top-down thing going on. The This is the thing that a lot of Democrats, rank and file members of the party, just don't get. You may pull the mainstream, the rank and file members of the party to the left, but that doesn't do diddly squat to the establishment of the party. And since the party is a top-down corporation instead of a grassroots political party, you can pull the members of the party as far left as you want. You can elect as many leftist candidates as you want. It's not going to change the party. The only way the party itself is going to change, the only way the establishment, the people in power, are going to change is if they want to change. And so far, they've shown absolutely no desire to change. They don't have any kind of message except we're not Trump and Russia, Russia, Russia. That's it. There's no, oh yeah, wait, one more thing they've got, identity politics, which they use as a wedge issue to keep the people divided. Because if the people ever unite, if the people ever come together in solidarity to fight the 1% that the Democratic Party establishment now represents, and has since at least 1993, possibly as far back as 1989, then they're screwed. They may retain control of the party apparatus, but they're not going to have any power. So, I mean, it is possible, but the deck is so heavily stacked against any kind of reform or takeover that you'd have better luck trying to take over the Republican Party. They didn't ever change their charter and bylaws to prevent any grassroots takeover or reform, and that's one of the reasons that the Tea Party had some success in the Republican Party. I mean, the Tea Party was very well financed, too. It was an astroturf organization from the beginning, but still, the Republicans didn't ever make their party anti-democratic the way the Democrats did. So, I mean, yeah, you can elect people. You can pull the base of the party to the left, and the base of the party is at least more leftist than the establishment of the party. But that doesn't have any effect on the establishment. Anyway, so I mean, I rant about this fairly often too, and I'm going to just leave the rest of this article as well unread. So I will have it in the video description, so you can check out the article for yourselves and read that. Let's see. Nobody talking in the text chat, so I don't know. I see at least one person is still watching, and it may not be the same person. I mean, I can finish these streams and come back and look, and it'll say that I had 12 unique views, which means that at least 12 people came in and watched for, 30 seconds or so. Anyway. So, as long as we're talking about the Democratic Party and how fucking clueless the party establishment is, let's move on to the next article, which comes to us from CNN. And this is, let's see here. Let me see, where is this? I know I saved this article. Maybe I didn't save it. I could have sworn I did. This might be. Yeah, this is it. I'm pretty sure this is it. Yeah, this is it. Okay, so this is from CNN, and this was published on the 31st of December. It's by Carolyn Kelly. The title of the article is, well, variously given as, "When Democrats Talk Medicare for All, You Start Losing the People in My State," or "Outgoing Democratic Senator Warns His Party, When You Talk Medicare for All, You Start Losing the People in My State." Outgoing Indiana Democratic Senator Joe Donnelly said Democrats need to be careful in promoting too many progressive ideas in red states like his because they'll, quote, "start losing the people in my state," end quote. Medicare for All is a progressive stance that some Democrats worry could alienate Midwestern voters from the party going into the 2020 presidential election. It has become popular thanks to liberal leaders like Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. Okay, now let's get everything. I'm just going to have to correct this whole fucking paragraph here, apparently. It's not Medicare for All, it's National Improved and Expanded Medicare for All, NIEMA, not M4A, because the Democrats, the establishment Democrats are trying to co-opt the term Medicare for All, and they're talking about access. Now, progressives are not talking about access, we're talking about Medicare for All, we're talking about national improved and expanded Medicare for All. A lot of people are trying to cast Medicare for All as, well, Medicare sucks. Yes, we're talking about improved and expanded Medicare, not what we have now, but making it better. And we're talking about, it's not just access, it's not being able to, buy into a plan. It's you will have your health care insurance provided for you by the federal government. And it's not socialized medicine. What it is nationalized insurance. Right now we have, one of the things that the Republicans were squealing about back when the Affordable Care Act was being discussed, before it even came to a vote, when they were still talking about a public option, which we didn't actually wind up getting, was socialized medicine and how there were going to be death panels, government bureaucrats deciding whether you lived or died, and blah, blah, blah. You know what, guys? You have private, for-profit insurance companies right now running death panels to decide whether you live or die, and unlike the government, they're interested in profit. And how do they make profit? By not paying your fucking claims. What the fuck? Oh, we don't trust the government, but we're going to trust these people who want to take our money from us. You stupid fucks, I swear to the gods. Private for-profit insurance companies don't exist to provide you with health care coverage. They exist to make a profit for their shareholders and executives. That's why they exist. That's why they are private corporations. This is not rocket science, and it's not brain surgery. This is fucking glaringly obvious if you would open your eyes and stop being scared of things that you don't really understand, because frankly, when you guys hear the word socialism, you think Soviet Union, and I'm telling you right now, there are many, many, many types of socialism, some of which even existed before Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels came on the scene. How do I know this? Because Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels criticized some of these other forms of socialism, which already existed, and they claimed that those forms of socialism were utopian. They referred to their own view as scientific socialism, and yet what they offered was something more pie in the sky by and by when we die than anything any of the other socialist perspectives were offering at the time. There was Lassalle in France, for example. Right? He was a socialist. Marx criticized him, called him all kinds of things, including a bunch of anti-Semitic slurs. There's all kinds of nifty stuff going on at the time that people just don't know, because we had a Red Scare in this country in the 1920s. We had another one in the 1950s. Now we've got another one right now going on. It never really went away because people have been indoctrinated to believe in this single line continuum in one dimension, that left is liberal and communist and right is conservative and capitalist. But that's not true, because the extreme left is, yes, Marxist communism, and the extreme right is corporatism, not capitalism. But you've got various grades along the way where you've got different kinds of socialism till you get to the center where you have social democracy. And then you've got various shades of capitalism going to the right from there until you get to corporatism at the extreme. Social democracy is a mixed economy. It is a centrist position. It has some elements of socialism and some elements of capitalism. So, I mean, there are all kinds of different... I mean, we have a social democracy in this country right now. It's considerably right of center at the moment, but it has been a little closer to the center in the past. Most of the European nations have a social democracy. And you think, I mean... You think that socialism means big government. And I'm going to tell you, again, the basic ideal of socialism is a very simple one. The means of production should be owned and controlled by the producers. That is to say that if you work in a grocery store or in a factory, then you should be a part owner and have a voice in how the business is run. Now, this doesn't have to be absolute pure anarchy and pure democracy where everybody has an equal voice. I mean, you do need management people. You do need foremen, you know. But you want not the CEO's pimply-faced geek son who can't get a job anywhere else because he's, you know, a wastrel or you know, whatever, completely incompetent, mindless rich kid. You don't want that person to be the manager or the executive or the foreman, because they don't know the work, they don't know the job, they don't know what is possible, what the people can do, and what is not possible, which is why you get these kids that come in and start managing conveyor belt factories, and they want to speed up the conveyor belt so that the people can't actually do the work they're supposed to be doing. You know, they want to increase production, but they don't want to increase the number of people working. They don't want to add any new machinery because that would cost them money. They just want to increase output so they can increase profit. And they're going to cut as many corners as they can because that's what they're taught to do in their business schools these days. Maximize profit, suck as much money out of the company as you can, and then just before it goes bust, offload it to some gullible schmuck who will come in and try to fix all the shit that you caused. Well, no, that's not how you run a company, dumbasses. You run a company with people who know what the job is, what can be done, what is impossible or very unlikely, and how certain things could be done, but it's going to take some more investment. You're going to have to get some more machinery. You're going to have to hire some more hands, and you can't speed up the goddamn conveyor belt. You just put in more conveyor belts, okay, and hire more people to work them, okay? That's the simple way to do it, and that's the way that it actually will work. So what you do is, in a factory like that, where the producers, the people who work there, actually own and control the factory, you find a person who works with you, who knows the job, who's very skilled, who has experience, who's been there for a while, and knows the ropes, maybe can do every fucking job in the factory, and you say, this is the person who should be our foreman. Duh! Not pimply-faced geek who can't get a job anywhere else because he can't keep his thumb out of his ass. But the person who knows what the fuck they're doing. What the job is, what's possible, what can and can't be done, and so forth and so on, and how to maximize, you know, output without causing problems. Without stripping the company of any worth whatsoever, working the people there to death, working the machines until they're, you know, falling apart, and then trying to sell the shit to somebody else who has to come in and try to fix it. No. You know what I'm talking about when I talk about socialism? When I talk about the workers owning the place where they work and controlling that place, controlling that business. I'm talking about a cooperative. You've heard of a cooperative, haven't you, my friendly Midwestern people? I know you have, because I lived in Arkansas. I lived in Texas. I've lived in rural areas. I know. I was in FFA. I took Agri when I was in high school, okay? I know what a cooperative is just as well as you do. Now, is a cooperative a scary thing? Is it centralized government and central economic planning? Is it big government running your life? No. It's a local co-op. It's your local grocery co-op that you go to and you get better prices. And the people who work there are better workers because they're paid better, they're treated better. Why are they paid and treated better? Because they are part owners and part controllers of the fucking grocery store. Dude, seriously, this is not hard. That's what socialism is at its root. Now, the thing is, one of the reasons there are several different types of socialism is because of disagreement over how to effect this, you know, in the most effective manner, how to accomplish worker ownership and control of production in the most effective manner. And you've got some people who talk about nationalizing everything. And then you've got people like myself who are cooperative commonwealth socialists who say local democratic economic democratic economy, local economy, democratic cooperatives at the local level which work with other cooperatives through a confederation. Okay? It's not some kind of 5-year plan from Stalin. Okay? And I can go on a long discussion about why Stalin wasn't actually a socialist or a communist. I mean, he might have believed in Marxist communism, and there is some indication that he did, but Marxism says that Marxist communism will come about after a period of Marxist socialism, and that Marxist socialism is a transitional phase between capitalism and Marxist communism. And I'm qualifying Marxist communism because there are other kinds of communism which don't really have anything to do with Marx or modern socialism in the sense that we have talked about it. You know, I mean, the early Christian church had a communist society. It didn't work out very well, and there's a passage in the book of Acts which explains, gives a story about why it didn't. Ananias and Sapphira. So, I mean, some of you may be familiar with that. But that was just one experiment. A lot of people will tell you that communism has never been tried. Well, yeah, because a communist society in Marx's vision is one which is both classless and stateless. And I don't think anybody here is stupid enough to tell me that Stalinist Soviet Union or Maoist China was even close to stateless. So, I mean, yeah. Anyway, so nationally improved and expanded Medicare for all is not big government taking over and making medical decisions for you. Oh, but how are they going to pay for everything? Well, we'll get to that later, too. I mean, I'm going to tell you about MMT and why you don't have to tax or borrow in order to fund spending. But we'll get to that either later tonight or sometime tomorrow. But National Improved and Expanded Medicare for All, as H.R. 676, the House bill, is currently written, would set up a regional boards of governors, and those people who would be on those boards of governors would be healthcare professionals, not government bureaucrats. So you'd have doctors and nurses and surgeons and so forth who would be making those decisions. And that's kind of what you want, isn't it? That your healthcare should be between you and your doctor. And this may not be your doctor, but it's going to be a doctor. Someone who knows, this is possible, and this is maybe we don't want to do this, and maybe we don't want to let you have this experimental drug because it's going to turn you into a 2-foot tall impotent half badger creature or something. They are doctors, they're not bureaucrats. And I've bitched about bureaucrats not understanding scientific language and medical language for a long time. And I think there was a recent stream where I talked about how the American Psychological Association eliminated the separate categories of dependence and addiction in the DSM-3TR, I believe it was. Might have been DSM-3. It might have been DSM-3TR. Anyway, it was sometime in the 80s, I think. Eliminated the separate categories of dependence and addiction. And bureaucrats decided that dependence and addiction were the same thing, which they aren't. And I've explained this before too. A person who is okay. So there are three levels of both dependence and addiction. The least serious is psychological, and then you've got physiological or physical, and then you've got functional. And functional is the most severe type of either dependence or addiction. But let me point out that dependence is not as serious as addiction. Now, you may, and probably do, know a person who is diabetic and needs insulin. A doctor will tell you that the person is insulin dependent. That person is functionally dependent on insulin, okay? They have to have it in order for their organism to function. If they don't get it, they die. That's pretty serious, isn't it? Yeah, it is. But do you think that person is an addict? No, you don't. You know better. So, bureaucrats don't. You would think that they would know better, but they don't. So you want a medical professional, a healthcare professional to make these decisions rather than a government bureaucrat. I agree with you completely. Regional boards of governors made up of healthcare professionals. Those would be the people making the decisions about coverage. Not some pencil pusher back in D.C. who doesn't know anything about medicine or science, except some poorly understood crap that they've read that was probably prepared for them by some other idiotic bureaucrat who didn't understand what he or she was reading from the actual scientific literature. So, yeah, when we talk about the progressive stance, it's not Medicare for all, it's national improved and expanded Medicare for all. And we're not talking about socialized medicine, we're talking about nationalized insurance. And yeah, I said nationalized because some things can be done better by the government than they can by private for-profit corporations. Now, I mean, it would be great if we could put together a cooperative to do this, but then you're going to wind up still with the same kind of thing, and it's going to have to be monopolistic because otherwise you don't have the same pool. Everybody pays into a pool. Whenever you have insurance with a particular company, you pay a certain amount every month or every 3 months or every 6 months or every year, however you do it. You pay your insurance policy fees periodically. And that money goes into a pool. And I don't mean like a swimming pool or anything like that, of course. I mean just like money, a pot of money, to use a metaphor, because it's not really. But, you know, it goes into a fund or an account or whatever. Now, when someone who is insured by the same company as you becomes ill or needs a surgery or has to have an x-ray or whatever, you know. And they file a claim, or their doctor files a claim, or their doctor's office actually files a claim. The medical billing person in the office files the claim with your insurance company, assuming they actually filled out the forms right, and if they didn't, it's not necessarily their fault, because every one of these insurance companies has its own code for everything. There's no standardization whatsoever, and if you get one letter or one number wrong, they'll deny the claim, right? So you've got that issue that's causing a lot of headaches and a lot of extra work for people that really don't need to do all that extra work. You've also got the problem of does this clinic or doctor take my insurance? You know, maybe you can't go to that clinic or that hospital or that doctor, and you have to go find someone who does take your insurance because they don't have a contract with your insurance company or whatever. But anyway, so when they do file a claim and it gets approved, then the money that goes to pay that claim comes out of that same pool that you paid into. So people talking about how they don't want to pay for somebody else's health care coverage, you're already doing that. Yes, you are. That's why you pay into your insurance company every so often. That's where that money goes. It's not money for your health care insurance. It's money for everybody's. That's why they have the pool. It's everybody pooling their money together. Theoretically, then, they would be covered by the pool if their insurance company didn't exist for the purpose of making a profit for the shareholders and the executives. Now, a government insurance would not have the purpose of making a profit for executives and shareholders, because there wouldn't be any executives and shareholders. And the people who run the program don't make any more money by saving payment, by refusing payment. Okay? If they refuse to pay your claim, it's not going to give them any more money than it would if they did. So there's that. So when it says here Medicare for All is a progressive stance, no, it's not. National Improved and Expanded Medicare for All is a progressive stance. That some Democrats worry could alienate Midwestern voters from the party going into the 2020 presidential election. It has become popular thanks to liberal leaders like Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. Except, no, it hasn't, because Bernie Sanders has always described himself as progressive and not liberal, and stated very clearly that there are, I think he said there is a difference, but there are actually several differences. And I've talked about this as well. I mean, a lot of people like to try to conflate the two words, liberal and progressive. They don't mean the same thing. Okay, and the Democrats, a lot of Democrats, after the 1988 election, started calling themselves progressives, whereas before they had called themselves liberals. They didn't change any of their views. They didn't adopt any progressive ideals. They just changed their name because they didn't like what the Republicans had done with the word liberal throughout the 1980s. I talked about this in my recent article at Real Progressives as well. I'll be putting another article up there soon. I don't know exactly when, because I've got to do a little more revision to it before I put it up. But anyway, let's see. So, I'll continue with this article. When asked by CNN's Dana Bash on the lead with Jake Tapper if Democrats could be viable without appealing to interior state votes, Donnelly replied, quote, "I don't know how you do that," end quote. Donnelly said that during President Donald Trump's visits to Indiana in the weeks before the midterms, in which Donnelly lost his seat, the president made not voting for Republicans seem like a personal betrayal by voters. Donnelly said, quote, "We have not made enough of a connection that the people of my state understand culturally. We, Democrats, want to make sure you succeed," end quote. Oh, wait, not end quote. "But when you talk Medicare for all, you start losing the people in my state. When we start talking about, hey, we're going to work together with the insurance companies to lower premiums, that's what connects. The talk on the coast just doesn't get it done in the middle," end quote, he said. Now, I have to point out that this guy, Donnelly, Joe Donnelly, yeah, Pat the Burner over on Twitter sent out a tweet about this, and he said, "Guy who lost his election because he was against hashtag Medicare for all says Democrats will lose elections if they support hashtag Medicare for all. CNN, of course, runs another misleading headline to pretend there isn't massive support for hashtag Medicare for all." So, yeah, I mean, yeah. The guy who lost his election because he didn't support Medicare for all is now trying to tell Democrats that if you talk about Medicare for all, you start losing the people in my state. No, dumbass, you lost your election because you opposed Medicare for all. That's why. Don't talk shit here on CNN and try to make it seem like this corporatist Democrat horseshit is what the people in the Midwest want. It's not. The people in the Midwest want their health care coverage. They don't want to have to work with insurance companies to lower costs. They don't want to have to go shop around between doctors and dentists and clinics and hospitals to find out which one of them takes their insurance. They don't want to have to deal with all this horse shit. It's a headache. The vast majority of people in both the Democratic and the Republican parties, and an even larger number of independents, support National Improved and Expanded Medicare for All. Business owners support National Improved and Expanded Medicare for All. Why? You ask why? Well, it's really quite simple. Right now, with ACA, they have to help provide part of the insurance for their employees, and they don't want to do that. That's one of the reasons we have so many part-time jobs, because if you work 30 hours or more a week, your employer is expected to at least help cover the cost of your insurance. Yeah, see, they don't want to do that. And so then we come to the question of, well, then I'll have to pay higher taxes. Well, no, you won't, because it's really quite simple. The United States federal government is the issuer of a sovereign, free-floating, non-convertible fiat currency. It does not need to borrow or tax in order to fund spending. The only constraint on spending is resources. As long as our GDP is strong, as it is, very strong right now, we have more than enough resources to cover spending with our fiat currency. Furthermore, the so-called deficit and debt that everybody gets bent out of shape about, they're not the same thing. But the debt that everybody talks about, yeah, that debt is pro forma. Do you know what that means? It means it's an exercise. It's just basically a hypothetical thing. And you know why that is the case? Because that debt cannot be called and it cannot be force redeemed. And when it is redeemed, it is only redeemed in our fiat currency. Our government cannot become insolvent in its own fiat currency. Why? Because we're not on the goddamn gold standard anymore. Jeez. These are just facts, and everything is so obvious. There's nothing complicated about this Howard Schweitzer and Joe Bongiovanni. There's nothing complicated about this. Or you're trying to make it all complicated. There's nothing complicated about it. We're not making anything complicated. You're trying to pull shit out of your ass that doesn't come out. Well, we've got to nationalize the Fed. The Fed is nationalized. We've got to do this. We got to green the dollar. You're trying to do things that don't have to be done for no good reason, except to stroke your egos or something. I don't know. But that American Monetary Institute shit is shit. We don't need it. And we've got 12 fucking years, 11 now. We've got 11 years in which we can take action to avert the worst consequences of the approaching climate catastrophe. We're talking about an extinction level event which is coming. If we act now, we can avert the worst consequences, the worst effects of that. That's what this Green New Deal with federal jobs guarantee is about. We don't have time to fuck around with changing the entire system because you don't like capitalism. I don't like capitalism either. I'm a cooperative Commonwealth socialist. Okay? We got to get rid of private banks and make public banks. Dude, shut up. We have 11 years. 11 years. You're not going to get in power in that 11-year period. You're not going to convince the Democrats and the Republicans to do what you want in that 11-year period. And the Green Party, as much as I would like to see it get in power in that 11-year period, is probably not going to dominate all branches of government in time to start working on that shit and get it finished and then do the Green New Deal. Sorry, we don't have time to fuck around. But we don't. And it's not my fault, and it's not your fault, but we don't have the time to fuck around with your pet project. We can finance the Green New Deal with a federal jobs guarantee right fucking now. Do you not get it? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm actually yelling at my own subscribers when I mean to be yelling at you dumb fucks. Jesus Christ. We don't have time to screw around, and we don't have to. We can finance, we can fund the spending for a Green New Deal right now that will help transition us away from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy and put people to work rebuilding our national infrastructure, which is crumbling, and transitioning to the green energy. See, we need people working. We need people working at a living wage, and we can do that because we do have a sovereign, free-floating, non-convertible fiat currency. You worried about the debt? Are you Reagan-esque fearmongers worrying about the deficit, which is actually a benefit for the people and the private sector? That's Reagan shit. I thought you were leftists. You sound like right-wingers. Anyway. So, there you go. I apologize to my subscribers for yelling. I did not intend to yell at in any of my videos or streams, and I didn't really yell. I certainly did raise my voice a bit though. So, but I do apologize. I do apologize for that. But I've had a couple of interactions with Howard and Joe, who are in charge of the Green Party. Oh my goodness, did I lose something? I lost all the stuff that I was working on earlier. So I'm going to have to put it back in later. Oh, well, shit. I'm not sure what happened to it, but anyway. Yeah, I apologize for raising my voice here. That's not something I generally do. So, I don't know how I closed that. It's closed, though, apparently, because it's not here. Huh. So, well, that's odd. So let me have a look-see in here at the external text chat and see if anybody has said anything. Also get an idea of... we've been going for almost 2 hours, and I do have quite a few more articles to go through, and now I've lost count of what I've done, because I had the document open where I was saving all of these articles into and titles and links into a document so that I could put them into the video description. And as it happens, I have a total of 18 articles. Well, no, 16. I have 16 articles that I had selected to go through tonight and tomorrow. Seems like maybe Friday evenings, Friday nights or whatever are going to be me reading a little bit of a few articles and then expressing how pissed off I am at the stupidity of the Democratic Party and the Republicans, and maybe even occasionally at my own party, as I just did. And I'm going to be a little more vitriolic towards some of them because they're my own party and they need to pull their heads out of their asses. I mean, they're supposed to know better, but they're sitting there, do-de-do-de-do-de-do. We've got to green the dollar. We've got to nationalize the Fed. We've got to do it. No, we don't. And we don't have time for that shit. So you guys grow up, catch up, and realize that most of the theories you're working with are based on a situation which hasn't existed since 1971. Well, I'm aware that we're not on the gold standard. Well, then fucking act like it, dude. You know it, but you're not actually allowing it to register. We don't have a sovereign currency. Yes, we do have a sovereign currency. Come on. I mean, you got people like Stephanie Kelton, who was a visiting scholar at Cambridge University. You got Randall Wray. You've got Ellis. All of these very, very knowledgeable and intelligent economists who talk about modern monetary theory. And it's not just a theory. It is an empirical description of how our money actually works right now. It's not something we have to put into practice or get adopted. That is how our money works. Right now. And it tells us what is possible with our current monetary system. You know why those things haven't been done? Because the establishment likes to keep the hoi polloi divided and squabbling amongst ourselves. They want us to think that Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and disability and welfare and SSI and all of these other social safety net programs are costing taxpayer dollars. They're not. I really think you know this, guys. I mean, come on. This is not hard. It's not complicated. Are you telling me you don't understand what we're saying? Because I would never have accused you of not understanding what we were saying. But maybe that's what it is. You don't understand. I mean, there are people who can explain it to you in relatively simple language. I don't want to seem like I'm being condescending, but come on. It's not a difficult thing to grasp. My economic training consisted of a class, a year-long class, when I was in high school, in just general economics. And, of course, what I have read since then in Marx and Engels and Gronlund and Friedman and Kelton and Ray and Mitchell and Mosler and so forth. I mean, I certainly have had an interest in economics, but as far as formal training, not just one class, 2 semesters when I was in high school. I think it was my senior year, but still. My bachelor's degree, double major, one major philosophy, and like most undergraduate programs in philosophy, at least in the United States, the focus was on logic and the history of ideas in the context of philosophy. Logic. See, that's something I know. That's something I do, and I know it very well. So, I also know how to analyze linguistic silliness. I understand rhetoric. I can look at rhetoric and analyze it and see where the bullshit is, because I'm trained to do that, formally. And I didn't stop my education with a bachelor's degree, but never mind. So, I mean, come on. Really, seriously. Please, please, please. Stop this AMI bullshit. And do what we have to do. Do what we can do already. Without all this extraneous horse crap that you guys are trying to push. It's not necessary, and we don't have time to fuck around with it. We need to do what we can do now. Because if we don't do what we can do now, there won't be time to do something else later. We can squabble about the Fed and various other things after we save the fucking planet. I mean, you know, Green Party, right? Green, right? People, planet, and peace over profit. Planet over profit. Yeah, but those private banks own stock in the Federal Reserve System. Yeah, they do, and you know, and they draw dividends from that, and that allows them to put people on the board. But the chairman is nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. The board itself is controlled by Congress. They do what Congress tells them to. Now, their leeway is in the fact that how they attempt to accomplish what Congress has told them to do isn't something Congress has any control over. And that's a good thing, because most Congress critters are not economists and don't really know diddly shit about economics. I mean, they haven't done a very good job managing other things, have they? No, they haven't. So, you want to put them in charge of the Federal Reserve System? Really? Boys, stop it. Anyway, it's been a little over 2 hours now. 2 hours, 1 minute, and so many seconds. And I'm going to go ahead and call this a stream, and I will go over the remaining articles that I have tomorrow. I'm going to go ahead and play us out with a little bit of music, I believe, just to make sure that the stream does actually go to the end. But if you have enjoyed the stream tonight, and again, I apologize for raising my voice. It's not something I generally do, and I even boasted about not doing it earlier. So please, if you did enjoy the stream and found it informative, educational, entertaining, whatever, please consider subscribing if you're not already. Hit the bell icon, ring the bell, you know, to be notified of all new content. Theoretically, I mean, it doesn't really work perfectly, unfortunately, but you know, it does sometimes at least notify you of new content. And consider sharing the link to the stream via your social media. If you really enjoy what I do here and or at the Progressive Flame, please consider becoming my patron through Patreon. The link to my Patreon is in the video description. I will have the article links to what I've talked about here tonight in the video description tomorrow, by tomorrow, I hope. And if not, certainly before the weekend is over. So check back if you'd like to read any of these articles in their entirety. And I will be doing a stream again tomorrow before dawn, before noon. Sorry, not before dawn. That's now. Before noon, probably. It might be as late as 1 p.m. Eastern Time. But somewhere around there. And assuming everything cooperates with me, which it didn't do tonight, which is why I got a late start. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say, until next time, have fun, but stay safe. For Republic News, this is Ji'ana signing off.